Let's say you have your Hebrew Bible in front of you, you open Exodus 20, what do you see? You see a text looking like that, lots of things inside. You can clearly see that this one has no dots. No dots.
Welcome to episode number 3 of the Bible in OBRY. I am your host, John. Today, it is the 10th or 11th of October, and I guess it's 2019. Now, the last 2 episodes, I filled you up pretty good on a lot of technical material, which I'd probably like to just continue to do the same, but I know that would be a bit much. I'm sure the first 2 shows were a bit much, but they were intended for any of you who endeavored to get into this yourself and start working on these things for yourself. So that, say anything happened to me or anybody else that you're receiving your information from, I would hate for you to be unable to continue to learn all of the really fantastic things there are to learn about the Bible. But we are going to dig in and going to look at some words and passages and really interesting things. Before I do that, I'm going to start with, it's 2 paragraphs. The opening paragraphs from a document that was created by the British and Foreign Bible Society. And it's all about the Masoretes and the punctuation of the Masoretes, okay? Here we go. Biblical Hebrew was the first classical language to be systematically punctuated. In comparison with modern languages, the system was very complex. There are more commonly used punctuation marks in Hebrew than there are letters in the English alphabet, and they are applied not only between phrases but to virtually every word of the Scriptures, indicating very precisely each word's relationship with others in a phrase, as well as dividing each sentence into hierarchically ordered word groups. This complexity, coupled with sometimes substantial orthographic variations between printed editions, has led many students of the language to neglect Hebrew punctuation entirely. The advent of computer typesetting, and in particular, the inclusion of these marks in the magnetic text of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, challenges scholars in linguistics and computation to cooperate in a more detailed analysis of this punctuation than has ever before been possible. But even without further research, it provides the opportunity to analyze the logical structure of the Hebrew text by computer and to apply the results to Bible translation and to translation checking. This paper is a preliminary attempt to stimulate such a dialogue, first by addressing in detail the historical background which gave rise to the distinctively Hebrew system of punctuation, and secondly by providing a brief account of the most common elements of the system. For any of you who are interested, this PDF is really easy to find. I think I found it on a simple Google search a long time ago when I was looking for material to help educate me on the Masoretic system. So again, it is by the British and Foreign Bible Society. And it's titled The Masoretes and Punctuation of Biblical Hebrew. Of course, the most notable points in this is first off, and in a number of Jewish publications, they admit this freely as well. All right, so the underlying idea is that these Jews, these Jewish rabbis called Masoretes, had preserved the tradition of pronunciation because there were no vowels in Hebrew. But they preserved the tradition of this pronunciation, and they translated that to all the wording of the text through their dots and dashes, their nikudot. Well, the thing that it does that they don't talk about is it causes schisms in words. It's the reason why, if you're thumbing through Strong's, and you can open Blue Letter Bible and start with H1. H stands for Hebrew. If you want to look at Greek words, G1 will take you to the very first entry of the concordance, the Strong's Concordance. There are other concordances, that's true, but I'm not calling them much better. And because they standardized everything into King James, you have basically Strong's coded to King James or Strong's coded to New American Standard. Now, I could have worked with New American Standard for the most part, and some people would think that the wording was much easier to understand. The thing is, I stated the King James for a number of reasons. First off, I think the King James is full of illustrations of how the King James itself was a tool, just like the Masoretic Hebrew was a tool of imprisoning the actual language and message. So I keep the King James around, and I refer to it frequently. And I use it in pretty much all my articles and the book that I am currently writing. I quote pretty much exclusively from the King James. In the blogs I started doing, I quoted mostly from the World English Bible because of its readability. But I've even rethought that. Again, it's not because I look at the King James as superior. You can never get that out of anything I've ever said or written. Anyways, so that's the big thing to take away from this. It's the thing that they never talk about. It's not just that they applied this punctuation, as they call it, to the text, which of course changes the pronunciation. You can have two words that have the exact same glyphs, but it changes the pronunciation entirely, depending on how the nikudot are arranged. And currently, I have looked high and low, and I've even asked a friend to look for me. I've asked a couple of friends to look for me, and nobody can find exactly. And I've checked the some of the more in-depth Jewish reference books there are concerning the subject of the hyphen, because that hyphen in Hebrew does the same thing it does in English. It takes two independent words and combines them into a single word. So it's very important to know whether that was part of the text or not, because that would represent another glyph. That hyphen, it would have to be part of the glyph set if it was original, and I've got a sneaking feeling that it wasn't. Now, in the next paragraph, he went on to say that what they did was, even though they claim that from the 7th to the 10th century, the Masoretes standardized the text and standardized pronunciation because they had carried it with them all through the centuries. They had standardized it, but the problem is none of it was standard. It was all a mess depending on where you went. I guess these scribes were working far too independently. Maybe they were all working on the best code, and it took them a long time to get that particular code for how they wanted to parse words out standardized. So in the form of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, that was the standardization of the standardization. It should make you think. So we're going to look at sort of the first part of a word study that I had to do, and I brought up the second part of it in last week's episode. It was the family of words, beginning with the two glyphs O and air. In particular, I paid attention to orum because there are entries of orum that can mean naked. There are entries that can mean crafty, subtle. And I illustrated to you how Adam and Eve were said to be orumim, naked, but in the next chapter, the Nahash was said to be orum, subtle. Now, I think there's one of two things that I think is going on there. And when I recently found a book about Hebrew orthography, and it is a critical book, it's also critical of a lot of Champollion's and his associates' translation of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Champollion is the guy who's championed. It's kind of funny his name is Champollion and sounds so much like champion. Egyptian hieroglyphics. He's the guy. If you happen to watch a mainstream special on the deciphering of Egyptian hieroglyphics, they're going to probably mostly focus on Champollion. Anyways, he's very critical of him too. I rather like him thus far. And the interesting thing is he does tend to cut through a lot of bull right at the start. And he brings up a really good point about our modern languages and weaknesses of the modern language we use, which of course I am in 100% agreement that it is weak, that the modern language of English and what has been done with what modern languages we do use over centuries now, because none of them have remained static, is if there was any real inherent meaning that people once perceived in the now letters, then glyphs, it's gone. They have removed that. And in doing that and turning glyphs into letters and making a language that was first intended to be ideographic into something that is simply only phonetic, it lays the groundwork for a medium in which to utterly deceive. Anybody who's had to deal with lawyers or go to court or legal work or deal with a bank, financial institution, anything like that, knows that they use words all the time to deceive, to hurt you, to imprison you. Words are very powerful. So, of course, it's ridiculous to think that they haven't attacked the word. So when I was thinking about this, a number of the triglyphs, so there's basically two main root families. There's the biglyph, and that's made of two glyphs, a root, and that's about as small as you get. You're not going to find a single glyph as a word in the OBRY Bible whatsoever. You need at least two. So you have biglyphs and you have triglyphs. What I started finding was even all of these entries of words that are said to be triglyphs, they contain a biglyph within them. And then the third glyph is a modifier, whether it occurs at the beginning or at the end, and sometimes it will occur in the middle. You could take something like dad, so that would be a de and a de, just a biglyph word root, dead. If you inserted the oo in between them, dad on its own could be, well, anyways, it's translated as possibly breasts or nipples, paps, and actually sometimes as uncle, and a term of, like a term of endearment, okay? So if you put the oo in there, you get a bit different word. So that's an example of taking a biglyph root and turning it into a triglyph root, where you're adding the glyph in the center instead of the front or the back. I believe that this is actually going to be what dictates what syllable a lot of these words stress. So the odd thing was, when I was doing the word studies on, for instance, aurum, there was also oral with the L at the end, which means uncircumcised. If you add, I believe it is, if you add an E after that, it is the word for foreskin. But the strange thing is, as I started going through all those words with the or at the front, those two glyphs, O and air, I started noticing that all of the words, even the ones that were badly, poorly, or wrongly translated, that I spent some time to try to figure out what it was most likely, and it usually always came back to being very much like one thing or another. What I found was exactly what I'm talking about. That there is going to be a biglyph contained within these triglyphs, and it's usually going to be either at the front with the modifier being the third glyph, or at the back with the modifier being the first. Occasionally you will have a vowel, or singer as I call them, a vowel modifier in the middle. But this is really important because when Wall, the man who wrote that book I was talking about, his name was Wall, D.D., Doctor of Divinity, when he was talking about the problem with phonetic language, a language that is purely phonetic, he was talking about homophones and diaphones. Now, homophones are a letter that has only one sound it can make. Diaphones are letters that have multiple sounds they can make. And he talked about the big problem with diaphones. One of the chief ones that he mentioned in that was C. And he said that most Greek scholars are going to readily admit the problem with a C diaphone, because words that should be pronounced with a K sound have been presented to us with a C sound. Words like Kaiser. It should have always been Kaiser, but it was presented to us as Caesar. Anytime you can phonetically change a word, you can change people's perception of that word. If you have 10 entries in a row, and those entries are all basically the same word, but you get somebody who comes along and adds all of this punctuation to it, which changes the way that you are to pronounce the word. Whether it changes it in the fact that you change what should have been an O vowel sound to another vowel sound, whether you change it in a way that adds syllables, whether you should change it in a way that takes consonants, or walkers as I call them. You take those consonants and you change the sound of them. You change sounds that should be sh to sounds that are s. That got a lot of Ephraimites killed in Judges 12. You take sounds that should be t and you change them into th. They do that with a number of letters. You take sounds that should be h, and sometimes they're ch, and sometimes they're h, and sometimes they're silent altogether. This changes our perceptions of words, and it has allowed them to get away with this schism to whole groups that are essentially supposed to be, probably, from all I'm finding, the same word. And they've really broken it up really, really badly and applied all kinds of new and different meanings, which confuse us. Anybody who reads the Bible, who says, I've always understood everything I've read in the Bible all the time, then I want to be your best friend. If you're serious, if you really have understood everything all the time, I want us to be the best of friends, because I need somebody who understands it all the time to explain it to me, because the thing is, I don't understand it frequently. Either that or we're never going to be friends because you're a liar. And I think it's usually the latter. So today, I'm going to spend some time talking about the first part of that word study I did, which was all focused on the word orib. So that same root, the O in the air, with a be modifier, or perhaps it is actually the air and the be with an O modifier. And that's something that we're going to look into, and we're going to test these entries in the text and see what we find. Now, when I reference my Strong's OBRY list, which I suggest everybody download from the OBRY Project website on the reference page, because it's going to give you a visual aid to these words that you're not really going to get from any other concordance. I have at the front of it all the glyphs in the OBRY glyph set. I have their Hebrew equivalent, and I have their key equivalent. So you'll know on the keyboard what to punch in when you want. And there's really, for the most part, they are English equivalents, these glyphs. And they even often look just like our English letters today. There's only a few variations that you have to get used to, and I've tried to make them about as easy as possible. It's pretty darn easy to get used to. So, by referencing this, I can see that orib, the triglyph O, er, be, has 11 OBRY entries as just orib. Then there's 2 entries of orib e with the added e at the end, an entry of oribun, 1 entry of oribi, and 1 entry of orib t. And that is at the end there, that is a ta and an I. So it's not just one letter, orib t. So that comes to 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. 16 entries. The last 5 entries are actually just variations of that triglyph, orib. Some of these variations are just variations for context. They don't even really belong. The only time they belong in here is in a case like we'll look at with, say, oribe. Because OBRY, in at least one case, is used as a description of a geographical phenomenon. So I would say that does deserve an entry. But many of these don't. Because if we were just taught properly what the suffixes and prefixes and affixes are and what they do to the words. And I suggest that there's actually a relatively comprehensive Wikipedia page on both Hebrew suffixes and prefixes. There isn't one on affixes. Nobody really has approached affixes. I'm the first person that I even know of that has approached the issue of affixed glyphs, mostly vowels or singers, and them having a bearing on the word. Anyways, you can find those two pages, Wikipedia pages. They're decent, relatively comprehensive. And then you can find various Hebrew and Jewish publications that are going to tell you at least a little bit about suffixes and how suffixes are used. Don't be surprised if you find it excruciatingly confusing, because it is. And I don't see that as an accident. And the other thing is, don't also be surprised if it's inconsistent, because these don't always work as they are purported to. So let's just look at start by looking at the first entry of OBRY. It is Strong's H for Hebrew, H6148. So what I always do is open H6148, open a tab for it in Blue Letter Bible, because there's a number of aspects to Blue Letter Bible that are really helpful. And at the same time, have eSword open, excuse me, when you download and install eSword. It's got a tab right at the top. It's the fifth tab from the left. It says download on it. If you click on download, the first thing that comes up is Bibles. You open that up, and there are tons and tons of Bibles that you can download for free. Some of the best ones I suggest getting are the ones that are they're the plus versions. So, let me find here real quick. For instance, Hebrew. They have, let's see. There's the where is that at? The Hebrew Old Testament or Tanakh, and then the Hebrew Old Testament with Strong's numbers. Whenever you can find those, there's the Greek New Testament and the Greek with strong numbers. There's KJV with Strong's numbers. That comes standard. Anytime you can find those are super, super helpful. Get both. Then you can look at it, like I would say in its pure form, but Hebrew isn't pure. But anyways, you can look at it at least without the strong numbers and then with. What is interesting is, and I really like this about the Hebrew Old Testament or Tanakh in the download portion here, that version does not have any Nikudot. The only Nikudot that I'm aware of, besides the hyphen or kametz they call it, because I'm not too sure about that, is unfortunately they have the little dot above the sha that they call shin to transform it from shin to sin, thereby changing the OBRY glyph set into the Hebrew 23 character alphabet. Now, I don't pretend to know all kinds of stuff about numbers, the esoteric importance of numbers, but I know that they use numbers all the time for esoteric importance. That's why Revelation 13 warns us. about this beast and who would be running it and what their numbers would be. It would be 6, 6, 6. And we see them using the 6 all the time. So I never just blow off something that is as important as changing a 22 glyph set to a 23 glyph set when I know that 23 is such an important occulted number to them. So every time you do, you can, in your eSword, you open up an instance in Blue Letter Bible of H6148, and you go to your eSword and you select the KJC tab in dictionaries. Make sure that the little book icon and little link icon below the tabs to the very right are both highlighted. And then go to the very right, click in that little dialog box there and punch in H6148. And it will also take you there. Now, what's really great about this is that, for instance, the first occurrence of it is Genesis 43:9. I can click on that and make sure I'm in my Hebrew Old Testament plus Strong's numbers and find that entry, H6148, in the verse, and it's the second word in the verse. Right-click on it. It gives me a box. It says at the top, quick search on H6148, and I'll go to the right of that, and I'll select Old Testament, and it will show me all of the occurrences of that entry in the Old Testament. What it does is it highlights the number, and then just to the right of the number is the word. You can use this to make sure that they aren't passing off one word as another, which they do all the time. What I'm looking at right now are just variations of OBRY with different prefixes and suffixes. It is not a different word, nor am I seeing occurrences that have affixes in them. When there's an affix in it, and there's enough of them, it is enough for, well, to raise my eyebrows and for me to take note of that, because what I have found up to this point is that an affixed oo or e or ah, or just any one of the vowels or singers can make enough of a difference in the word for it to matter. So H6148, the definition for it given and the way it's used is as a surety mortgage, and they even use it as mingled a couple of times or pledge. They use it as a lot of things. I mean, my goodness, you look at the KJC in eSword. Let's see, out of 23 occurrences, surety 8, metal 2, mingled 2, pledges 2, became 1, becometh 1, engaged 1, intermetal 1, mortgaged 1, occupiers 1, occupy 1, sureties 1, undertake 1. And you know something? Those aren't all synonyms. So, all right, moving right along, because we have a number of these to look at. Oops, come on, stop. All right, 6149. Again, it's OBRY, okay? And the way it's used, the last one is classified by Strong's and the Masoretes as a verb. And this one is also classified as a verb, and they say it is to be pleasant, sweet, or pleasing. And I'm not going to go through all the different ways they use every single one of these words. I'm going to go through the list first, and then we're going to go back over it and examine some of these. The next one, 6150, they classify as a verb, and they define as evening, darken, overspread. Well, actually, that was my definition. They just define it as evening or darken. Now, 6152 Now you'll notice they didn't go to 6151 because 6151 is an Arami or Aramaic entry. And I am going to mention that because it's important. All of these Aramaic entries that have an equivalent in OBRY are important because, as I've theorized for some time, the people that gave us what we understand today as Hebrew were Aramaic speakers. For centuries on end, the rabbis spoke and wrote in nothing but Arami, or Aramaic, as they call it. It was only recently that they started using Hebrew and teaching Jews Hebrew. The Jews mostly spoke Yiddish or whatever language of whatever country they were dwelling in. And the rabbis, mostly their holy language was Aramaic, not Hebrew. So we're always going to look at those Aramaic entries, and they're always going to tell us a lot. So 6152 is classified as a proper collective noun. And Strong's definition of it is Arabians. Yes, Arabians or steppe dwellers. That's where we get Arabian from, we're told, is Orab. All right, so 6153 is a masculine noun, and it's defined as evening, dusk, or sunset. 6154 is a masculine noun. It is described as a woof. A woof. It's King James English. A part of a garment. They define it as woof, mixed, interwoven, or knitted material. 6155, and at this point, we're still in Orab. 6155, a willow or tree of dark wood. It's a feminine noun. And the reason for that, let me click on 6155 real quick and do the comparison that I told you about. Yes, it appears in the first verse, Leviticus 23:40. U-or-a-b is how it appears. That's fine. You're always going to see it in the plural. Okay. But for some reason, I have it listed as feminine. It's not. I don't know if they list it as feminine in Blue Letter Bible. I'm going to check that real fast. They do. They do. I'm sorry. It is listed at 6155. My goodness. As a feminine. Okay. So 6156. It's classified as an adjective, and its definition is sweet or pleasant. 6157 is classified as a masculine noun. Its definition, a swarm of flies in parentheses, and we're going to get back to that. 6158, masculine noun, defined as a raven, possibly a crow. 6159 is a proper locative and masculine noun. Here, I will just bring up the entries here. Sometimes the thing that I don't like is that oftentimes, depending on the form the word takes, eSword might actually give you 0 entries, where Blue Letter might give you 1 or more entries. It's really screwy. Now, this is kind of funny in a way, too, because that just really reflects on how screwed up and inaccurate and unstandardized all of this is. And any of those scholars out there who tell you that it is standardized and they understand it, and it's so all whatever, the Heisers out there can take a flying leap because they're not being honest. Okay. All right, 6159 is also proper locative noun. One is they're giving as raven. The other one is chieftains of a Midianite army defeated by Gideon. Now that I remember, and the rock east of Jordan. Now the reason that eSword isn't going to give it is because you're going to see that entry, 6159. You're going to see that entry mixed into another occurrence of ORB. So instead of 6159, you might find it in 6160. I'm not saying that's where you're going to find it. But 6160 is classified as a feminine noun. It is defined as a plain, like on the prairie, the plain, the Great Plains. Okay. Okay, and then 6161. Let me go here. In Strong's. 6161 is classified as a feminine noun, and it is also defined as a pledge, token, bond, surety. Now we're getting into, we just did the two oribes, which is basically what they would say was the feminine, would be like the feminine version of orib. And in a way, I buy that because of what the E does at the end of a lot of these words. But I don't know if it's the way that we're taught or told that it acts, the feminine. In some ways it does. Like if you have the triglyph melek, which is M, L, and Ka. If you add that to the end of it, you get melke, which is, okay, the melek is king, that melke is queen. Now, and here's an interesting use of affixes. If you should add the A between the L and the Ka, you get the word malak, which is a messenger, and most often translated as angel. Now, 6162 is orabun. It is classified as a masculine noun, and again, the definition is a pledge or surety, security. But very similar to a number of these entries we've already seen. This is why I'm saying it's so redundant, because we're just seeing this same triglyph with suffixes. Now, 6163 is oribi, and it is classified as a proper patrial adjective. And they give as its definition Arabian. So this is the same way you would see OBRY, right? It would be things of Ober. Not only the patriarch who the language was named after, but cultural things, the people of named that OBRY. Okay, in this same way, you have Oribi. All right. And again, they're trying to say that it's Arabian or of Arabia and so on. The next entry is, let's see, that is the Orib T. And it is classified as an adjective patrial. And this one I think is the one that has two entries. Both of them are essentially during different lists. You have 2 Samuel 23:31, this Abialban, the Arbathite. And again, in 1 Chronicles 11:32, Abiel the Arbathite. They call him instead of Oribti. Unfortunately, I can't tell you more about this guy because, well, he's one of Dud or David's elites. David had his 300 Geburim, mighty men. And then he had these 30 that were even more elite than them. And this guy that they, let me see. I'm going to look at it in eSword so I can see it in both English and Hebrew. So anyways, it's again in English, Abialban the Arbathite. Okay, perfect. Now let's look at it in Hebrew. Let's see. And it's actually Abi Olbun Orbti. So I would say he has something to do with Oreb. You're going to see which Oreb as we go back over these. Abi, father of Olbun. Huh. All right. So let's see. And that should be our last. Yes. Our last Oreb, the triglyph variance entry. So let's take a look at some of these entries. Okay, so I'm doing these recordings over a few days. I'm actually doing, little by little. Because I had to. This subject actually required me to go back and review some of this stuff multiple times. So before I go into some of these occurrences of Oreb, or their variations, in the words of the Stuff They Don't Want You to Know series, here's where it gets crazy. So, as I said, that this is going to have to be based on probably one of two roots. Now, if we look at the root for or, what we're going to find is that our greatest bit of evidence is going to be in a group of I got to punch this in because I've been kind of all over the place just this morning on this. Starting at H5782, and I'll punch that in real quick. H5782, which is actually O-U-R. So, or. And just about any time that you're going to see this word, excuse me, with a prefix or a suffix, a lot of times that middle U is going to get dropped. It happens all the time. And I can't tell you definitively if that's supposed to happen or if that's something that developed scribally, that the scribes did down the road. It's really hard to say. Until we have a very, very strong grasp on this language, I don't think we're going to be able to make too many determinations concerning what scribes did or didn't do. Anyways, so there's kind of a family here of this O-U-R words, and they pretty much go from H5782 through, we'll say 5788. 5788 is the root with an un suffix at the end. And for the most part, well, except for the very first entry, 82, which they define as, they've got so many definitions. It starts with 1, to rouse oneself, awake, awaken, or incite. And then A, kal, that's the kind of verb they're saying, kal, to rouse oneself or awake. B, nifal, to be roused. C, polel, to stir up, rouse, or incite. Now, all of these terms I'm giving you before these, they're all Masoretic terms. They're based on Masoretic dictates, okay? It's based on what they said these words are according to that punctuation, the dots and dashes that they applied to the very same characters in order to dictate how they're used. And the funny thing is, now in D, it's hithpalel, to be excited, to be triumphant. E, hithil, to rouse, stir up. is 1, and then 2, to act in an aroused manner or awake. But if you should take 5782 and you put it into eSword in the KJC tab of dictionaries, and don't hit enter or you'll get that sound, and click on the first verse you see, and then find it in the verse, right-click, do quick search on Old Testament. And I'm doing this in the Hebrew Old Testament Plus. That gives me all the Strong's numbers next to the words. Well, what you're going to find is that these entries, they don't follow the structure of that listing. You know, it's listed as Orur, but the problem is, I mean, even the very first entry is Oir. Now, you could say the E is a prefix, and that's fine. But the whole point is the triglyph, the 3-character glyph root, is not Our with the middle U, it's Oir with the middle E. So you've got, basically in here, under just this one listing, you have Oir, Our, just Or, with no middle singer vowel. You have Orur with the double air at the end. You have that a number of times. Or again, Oir, Oir, Oror. Now, the funny thing is about Oir with that middle E is that word is most used for a city. Here's what's so interesting about that, too. And this is very complicated in a way, which I warned everybody about from the start. But the thing is, the point is, it probably shouldn't be this complicated. Every time you take, if you can determine what a biglyph is, so or, the biglyph with just the O and air, based on all of the entries that I've found that revolve around that as the root, it should mostly be referring to skin in some way. That's probably why Orum is naked. They also make like Maor, which begins with an M and then has O-U-R as nakedness, but they only use that one time. So it's a little hard to prove that it's specifically nakedness. It could kind of be something in that family, but a little bit different than nakedness, like Orum. You know, it's probably the reason why Oral, which is O-R-L, is uncircumcised, and Orle with the at the end is the foreskin. So many of the words where or is the root has to do with the skin or nakedness. But more specifically, you'll find in the O-U-R family, those entries, skin. Now, what I've got is, I've noticed this from the start. Oftentimes, when there is the ich inserted, and that's what the Jews call yod, when that is often inserted in a biglyph, it seems like it often denotes action. Whereas when the u is inserted, it seems like it more denotes something solid, but I'm not positive about that. It may actually just be something that creates a separation, because if you're looking at these like ideographs, and you have essentially an idea per glyph. And you have a word that's a biglyph word. It's made of two. Then the second glyph will have a direct bearing on the first in a certain way, where if you put a glyph between them, that second glyph, which is now the third, should not have exactly the same bearing on the first as it had before. What I find is that's kind of interesting is that if you just take this root or and you put that E in the middle of those two glyphs, you get the word that is most commonly used as city. And if you pay attention to the descriptions of cities, as opposed to villages or hamlets, there's different words for those. There's also mabutzer and butzer is used for types of places. And they also have their own sort of more specific. They seem more like they are cities of defense, like highly armed or fortified cities, as opposed to just the term OBRY in and of itself. The thing I find so interesting about that is that it would appear that possibly has got the same sort of, I don't know if I should say at least connotation to it, of the skin, as when we see OUR, which specifically is skin. Now, the other possible root that we can have in all of these words that are either OREB or variations of OREB that I just went over, they could possibly be based on a RAB root. We don't want to count that out. We want, anytime we look at a triglyph, we want to look at both possible sets of roots. Now, you're not always going to be able to find in the concordance a biglyph root. Sometimes you're going to have to really hunt around and maybe find all of the words that contain that root, all of the simple words. I wouldn't go with words made of 4 or 5 plus glyphs. I would go with mostly everything you can find that's made up of 3 glyphs. I would stick with that. And you're going to try to determine with the best degree you can, knowing that there is a certain amount of these words that are poorly translated, and there is a lot of fudging that goes on as far as presenting a word as one thing, but finding out that in the text it is written in a very different way, which makes it a different word. You have to keep these things in mind when you're hunting through this stuff, trying to determine what a root is. But looking at everything in which rab, so that's an air and a be, rab is the root for. All of it seems to point to a great amount. Whether it's a great amount spread out, whether it's like, for instance, Rababe, which is also oftentimes entered as Rebabut. Literally, the definition they give is multitude, myriad, or 10,000. So it's a really great number. The number 4 is actually Arabo. It has that rab in it too. There are really strange words, for instance, words that would describe a woman positioning herself for a beast, if it truly is beast, to have sex with her. It's literally, the word is used rabo. And now all of these they're made of glyphs. And depending on where the glyph is, Like, for instance, that word I just mentioned, rabot, it's also used for if you see phrases like four corners or something. It's going to be that word, rabot. Now, that's just taking the O part and taking it from the beginning, where we were just looking at it, to the end, with rab still as its root. There are these, every time you take a glyph, you move it to a different place with other glyphs. It, of course, is going to slightly adjust, or maybe greatly adjust, the meaning. I took some time a couple of months ago and actually listed every word I could find that they were pairs of words. So they would be one thing one way and the reverse. I paired them all together. So, for instance, a pair would be ab and ba. Ab is translated as father, and it's got enough entries and works contextually well enough to say, yeah, that's a pretty correct rendering. And then ba, it's usually translated as come, brought, came into, came near. It always has a bringing or coming as opposed to going connotation to it. But those are the same exact two glyphs. They're just ordered differently. Ab in the first sense, ba in the second. And they have different meanings. There's a lot of words like that. There's also aben, and aben is stone. And there's enough entries to trust that it probably means stone. Stone or rock. You can look at it in context in a lot of verses to make sure. But if you reverse it, you have nabah, which would be a prophet. Some of you have probably heard Jews or other people who are Hebraists, I suppose, refer to the prophets of the Old Testament. They'll usually call it Nevi'im because they pronounce the B's V. But it would be Neba or Nebaim. You can have Nebiah to prophesy, Neba'e, prophetess. Anyways, so they can have wildly different meanings when you reverse these simple biglyphs and triglyphs. So I'm just giving you some examples of that and telling you if you should look for all the simple biglyph and triglyph roots with rab in it, you're mostly going to find words that are connotating or denoting a spreading in some way or another. Another good one is rabbe. So it's the same biglyph root with the added onto the end, which in a sense, it's really hard to describe. Sometimes I want to say it softens. But the best description I've come up with is, for instance, if you went to the city of Hatzor, let's just say Hatzor, okay? If you specifically went to that city and were in that city, it would say in the text that you were in Hatzor. It might say Bahatzor, okay? But if you essentially were going to the area of Hatzor, say you had a friend or family that lived in one of the suburbs or just around the area or nearer to Hatzor than any other specific place or geographical location that could be described, but it wasn't specifically in the proper Hatzor city itself, you would say that you went Hatzoreh. Now, yes, it does oftentimes change a term that is usually used for male into female, like Naba'e for prophetess, Melekeh for queen, where Melech is king. It does that too. And so it works in a few different ways. Now, one way I've seen it work, and it also, at the beginning of the word, will make it the definite article. So if you have, like, you'll see this a lot, Eyam Egadul is the wording used for the great sea to the west of the inherited land, Canaan. Eyam Egadul, the sea, the great. That's literally mechanically how it would then be said. When you look at the glyph, it literally looks like a person spread out. And when you understand it in the way that I just put it, as far as being in a city or being around it, and if you were around it or near it, you would put that at the end. If you put the at the end of Melech, it would then, instead of king, it would be queen. But I don't mean to say this like in a demeaning way towards women, because that's what it seems like when you call these things masculine and feminine. To me, it seems a bit deceptive. It almost ought to be concrete, or the should be sort of abstract, maybe, instead of masculine and feminine. Okay. But in a sense, it's almost like adding that to the end slightly dilutes the strength of the word. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but it's simply just a descriptive suffix. So H7235, you have Rebbe, and that has 200-something entries. And again, you're going to see it mostly as multiply, greatly, increase, multiply. It is absolutely all over the place. There are various rab roots that are used, meaning broad. When Israel leaves Mitzrayim, and Yahweh tells Moses, that the land he's describing it to him, that he's going to take them to from Mitzrayim, he calls it Ethub, good land, and Rabab, or Rabut, a broad land, a big land, which was one of my first clues that we weren't talking about Palestine and Egypt. We're talking about Mitzrayim and Canaan in the land of OBRY. So when we go back and review these ORIB words, we're more than likely looking at either concrete or abstract forms of or concrete or abstract forms of rab. So just to precipitate it with that. So what I don't want to do is to extrapolate from entries that have fewer occurrences. I usually want to always find the entry of the word when you have multiple entries, like in the case of ORIB. You want to find the entry that has the greatest amount, or entries that have the greatest amount of occurrences. In this case, it's 6153. And it is evening, dusk, or sunset. Now, it's interesting. That one has a couple few hundred entries. So when you have something like that, it's probably the one that you can count on the most to have a concrete meaning. All right? So if we look at that and we try to understand why the evening or sunset would be named OBRY and which biglyph is the root for it, or rab, then we might be able to get somewhere with the other entries. Oftentimes, the only way to really do this, that I found, a method to do this, to try to understand why something is called what it's called. I mean, for instance, the first time we see OBRY as evening, or dusk or night, is Genesis 1. The evening and the morning were one day. What's interesting is, in Genesis 1 and many times after that, the term boker is used for morning. Now, what's strange about that is boker is also used many times for a cow. Now, is it the bak biglyph, or is it the ker biglyph? That's another good question. But you're going to see that a lot. And I believe that's one of the reasons why we may, we may mistakenly believe that there are a number of homonyms. I hope I've articulated well enough what the problem is with homonyms. Homonyms are a problem. They're not actually a nice, good part of a language. They can be used in flowery, poetic language in kind of a nice way. But as far as understanding goes, they're not productive. They're not a good addition to a language. It's the same thing with diaphones. Why? They just breed confusion. Having diaphones in an alphabet is confusing. So we never want to look at those as good things. And as it stands right now, not only the Hebrew lexicon, but the English lexicon, and guys, most of the English Bibles we have available to us are based on King James. And King James, they based a lot of their translation off of the Bishop's Bible and Matthew's, the few Bibles that came before. There's tons of homonyms. Not helpful to the language. Homonyms and homophones, not helpful. So I believe that that's probably why, besides the fact of the Masoretes parsing what probably should be a singular word and term that has all the same glyphs in it, parsing that out, like with OBRY, into 11 entries just in and of itself, and then an extra 5 with just suffixes on the end, which they didn't really need those entries. They just needed to properly teach us suffixes and what suffixes mean and do to a word, depending on whether it's an action or verb or thing or noun. So we know that the greatest occurrences is H6153, evening, dusk, sunset for OBRY. Now, if or is the biglyph root, one thing that I've noticed in many, many roots, whether they be 2 or 3 glyphs, biglyphs or triglyphs, oddly enough, and this isn't odd, but I haven't had time to prove it because, you know, working with the amount of OBRY words that are just listed in Strong's Concordance, it's pretty close to 8,000 entries. Well, it's many thousands of entries. There's 8,764 entries, but that includes the Aramaic entries as well. But there's only a few portions of a couple books in Aramy. So believe me, the amount of entries of Aramy is far, 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 far less. So it's many, many thousands of words in OBRY, okay? It's so much work to even try to go through all of the bi and triglyph roots within that list, find all of them that end in B or start in B, then try to figure out which one of them is more likely to be correct and not. And part of that is based on how many times they occur, because you can contextualize them more and more and more times to make sure that they're probably very close to that word they've been translated into. But the theory right now I have is that when you see B at the beginning of the word, that it, just like its prefix meaning, basically has it carries with it the idea of in, by, with, close to, or within. However, now, and you'll see that, for instance, with the root ba, being to come, not to go. There's other words for go, to go away from. Ba means specifically to come near someone or to go into something. Ba. However, if you should see it at the end of a biglyph like rub, it seems to have a denotation, or connotation at least, of going away. In a sense, like spreading, or at least away from. And the reason for this would be if the R, as many people out there who are trying to teach what they call ancient Hebrew, they'll tell you that the R represents a man's head. Now, for a long time, I thought that that was not accurate because of the amount of biglyphs and triglyphs I saw it in, what they amounted to. I thought, well, you can't put a man's head in here. And if you read, for instance, the Ancient Hebrew Lexicon of the Bible by Jeff Benner's Ancient Hebrew Research Center, you'll see that just applying a man's head to that R, it doesn't give you correct or accurate results. However, after reading a passage by Wall in the book I just spoke of, I'm starting to reconsider whether it is a man's head. And there's a reason for it. It may actually be the representation of a man's head, but that does not mean that it necessarily carries with it the concrete meaning of a man's head, like you have to apply man every time. There should at least be some sort of concrete and abstract to each one of these glyphs. And real quick, out of that book by Wall, the point that Wall brings up is that an emblem in and of itself is not necessarily representative of that thing. He says that, for instance, that's why, like the Egyptian god Osiris would have a hawk's head in a man's body, and it would represent a deity in the sense that the hawk's head was on the man's body. It would not necessarily represent a hawk or a man. It would represent something different, but those two elements would combine to represent something that was not them, because just a picture of a hawk or a bird does not necessarily mean that you're talking about a hawk or a bird. There should be a significance to it. He's talking about inscriptions on page 76. And for instance, he says, indeed, also in Dies or Diospolis of Egypt on the temple called Pylon is delineated by, in sculptures, a boy, the emblem of birth, an old man, that of death, and again a hawk, the emblem of God. Likewise, a fish, that of hatred, and a crocodile, by still another signification. Anyways, the interesting thing is I had to look up something about wind because of the book I'm working on, geography of the Bible versus that of the Levant in Palestine. And the word I was looking at was there's a word that basically means east or ancient or forward, and it's kadem. That's say a ku, de, and m, kadem. If you add an ich between the de and m, you get kadim. Kadim it's used in a couple of ways, but what you'll find it with a lot is a couple of different words. One having a connotation of fury or storm. And that's what you usually see translated as east wind, like in the dream of Peroah in Genesis, that Joseph, it's not translate, is it? Interprets, sorry. He uses kadim. And one of those forms, it's actually the word that means like a violent uproar or breath, but it's not ruch, the normal word that you'd see for breath or wind. And they translate that as east wind. The problem I have with that is that they're constantly assuming that the wind is coming from the east. But every time you see kadem or kadim or variations of kadem, it's always going in that direction, eastward. So when I punched that into a search, I found out something very interesting about east wind or an east wind. An east wind is actually a symbol that has been used in literature a great deal. And it's oftentimes been used as a symbol of something negative, dark, evil, or bad. Now, I'm not saying that's what it is in the Bible. That may be what they've kind of turned it into through their own connotations and the definitions that they're adding onto these words. All I'm saying is I believe that the wind being described is going towards the east because everything you see having to do with kadem and the variations of it are going east, meaning in that direction. That's why I wanted to look at that, and I found that as a symbol. So we're talking about symbols, okay? Because a symbol can, instead of it being as small as just the picture of the thing itself, if it symbolizes something, it has far more meaning, a depth of meaning to it, and can be used in a lot more precise way. So if we're looking at the picture of a man for the air, which we in English would call R, and actually it has its own equivalent in Greek too. It's called rho. And it actually, the Greek rho looks like our capital P. It looks like possibly a man's head. If you look at what they say is older Aramaic, and then they also call it Phoenician because they have to mix Phoenicia with Tsur and Sidon. Anyways, you'll see it over and over again. It either looks like an R or a P. Again and again, looking very much like perhaps a man's head or man. The thing is, you don't want to just look at it like that. Now, I'm not saying it can't carry that meaning ever, but I think what you more want to do is ask, what is man? And you can find the definition. If we can determine what all of these things are symbolizing, we should probably be able to find the definition to one degree or another within the Bible. man, Adam, is the pinnacle of Yahweh's creation. So if you look at this glyph more in the sense of it's transmitting the idea, I think, of high status more than just man. The O, on the other hand, so oftentimes carries with it the idea of sometimes being rounded, surrounding, and just about most of the ideas that an O would symbolize. I mean, just take a moment here and think about, since I've already talked about the B, the be, at the end of the word, and it probably being out because it's at the end as opposed to in when it's at the beginning. Just think about an O, an empty circle, looking at it, thinking about what it may represent. And we really want to try to get as elemental as possible with these things. And then the next, the air or R, and if it is the symbol of a man or a man's head, what would be the significance of that symbol? So think about that for one moment, and then we'll carry on with OBRY. One other significant possibility I do need to bring up. I do this all the time. I will look up the way that an English or Germanic letter works in modern words. Now I see the air in OBRY used in a very similar way, or at least placed in a very similar way that I see it used or placed in Germanic and English, and that is at the end of a word. Now if you think about the way that R is used in English and Germanic, at the end of the word, look at words like carpenter, philosopher. Then you have the ORs, doctor. I'm not sure how much different those are, but what it typically carries with it is the idea of one who does, and then you refer to the preceding root. Now, in Genesis 2, Adam was created to do, to take care of the gun. He was there to take care of the arets and the adame, the land and the soil, to be the hands that would be directed by Yahweh, his creator, and he would have dominion over everything. He was there as a caretaker. That is still the people who aspire to be the Israelites of the Bible, whether we're talking about those who believe in just the spiritual aspect of Israel or the physical genetic aspects of Israel. Either way, if you aspire to that, then what you need to aspire to is being the caretaker, and not the destroyer and enslaver of. Caretaker. So if we look at the R like that, it creates a whole possible interesting element, especially when it's put at the end of a word. So if we refer to or ur, which is almost always having to do with the skin or nakedness, then perhaps the O has, being symbolic of around or surround or encapsulation, and the R perhaps being a man or a man's head, but carrying with it the symbolism of to do. Then the skin is both a thing and an action. It is a thing that surrounds. Its action is to surround, to be around, atop of. This would help to understand, for instance, why a city is called an oir. Interestingly enough, the countryside is called Eor. You just take that E and you put it before the O instead of between the O and the R, which makes you wonder what the old sort of English used term tales of Yore were, since Yore is the countryside. Something to think about. So we have Orab. And if we're looking at Or as a sort of skin, and the B as a spreading out. And if you look at the night, just the connotations of night and dark are not as positive or natural as the connotations of light or day. Orab very much could carry with it a meaning of to cover, to spread out a cover, a coating or skin over the earth between the light that was once there in the day. Now, if we go with that and we look at many of the other entries, like for instance, 6148 oftentimes translated as surety, mortgage, or pledge, and it's probably most accurate as pledge when you look at it in context. And if you were to just apply to that to spread over or to cover, it works very well in all the passages that it appears in. Now, 6149 is translated as be pleasant, sweet, or pleasing. But when you look at it in context, and you actually apply cover to it, to cover, to spread over, or to blanket, it actually works far better in the verses that it's in, and it's in very few verses. 6150 and 6153, both evening, dark, and sunset. We went over that. Now, I'm not going to touch 6152, which they translate as Arabians, yet. 6154 is translated as a woof, mixed, or interwoven garment. But when you look at it in the context of the verses, you become very enlightened to something that they're doing. Now, besides the fact that they mix in Oreb, as in those people that they translate as Arab, or their communities, they mix that in to this entry, H6154, which is supposed to be, they translate it as woof, or part of a fabric. Most of the entries you're going to see this in is in Leviticus. Exodus once, mostly Leviticus. The few times that you see it in the prophets and whatnot, it's usually referring to these people that they translate Arab. But we're going to discuss that too. So for instance, Leviticus 13:48, whether it be in the warp or woof of linen, they say, or woolen, whether in a skin or in anything made of skin. Now, I had to go over a number of these passages. Yeah, they're kind of referring to different sorts of fabric. When you see the words woolen, skin, things made of skin, now the skin part is more correct because it is what? It's the word or. You're talking about leather. The woolen, you could probably argue over samar. And linen, they use the word pashte. However, you're going to see over and over again these terms, the warp or the woof. Now, it's referring to a type of disease, a communicable disease that you can actually see in the skin. Now, the priests, the Levites, they were the ones who were tasked with determining whether or not a a certain disease was not a good thing, was communicable, they would be in charge of quarantining off maybe people or towns, separating people. They would have facilities to separate people who might be ill. So that's why most of these references are in the book of Leviticus. Now, the weird thing is, warp or woof, and them trying to say that it was interwoven garment. Well, first off, it's also in the law that you're not supposed to interweave garments with different types of material. So I doubt that would be the case. The other thing is, you see these two things compared all the time. Warp or woof, all the time. Talking about this sort of communicable disease, this thing, something that they'd be able to see by sight. And we are talking about not types of fabrics, but things made from fabrics. Now, the word that's always translated as warp, it's actually shati. Okay, and then woof is this word we're looking at, oreb. When you understand that the simple word shet is used as a pointed or seated, then it's probably safe to say that they're talking about whether it be in, for instance, I think this is a relatively acceptable translation, far more than the translations we've got, whether it be in a cushion or blanket, whether it be in the seat or the head, for covering, as opposed to this idea of a warp or a woof. In that sense, again, oreb works quite nicely, and you get a better understanding of it. Now next, we're going to have two entries of orebe. Now this orebe is definitely talking about a tree. You can see that in context. However, and I believe that it's actually Strong's 6155. I am going to type that in really quick. If I get to the right window. Excuse me. They would say poplar, willow, or a tree characterized by dark wood. Well, it's not poplar, fella. Now, I've never worked with willow, but I can't imagine that's dark wood. I would think we would be talking more about, excuse me, if we're talking about a tree characterized by dark wood, we might be talking about walnut, padauk, mahogany, not poplar or willow. But it's interesting that they should say that. A tree characterized by dark wood. Why would they say that? Characterized by dark wood. Would it be because, since we've determined by the greater amount of occurrences of oreb as evening, sunset, or dark, that it carries with it the idea of being dark? This doesn't mean that it's necessarily a tree that is dark on the outside or the inside. Perhaps it is a tree that actually has very broad, overspreading branches that create a blanket of shade. But it certainly is a tree. Whether it's a species that's referred to as orebe or not, I'm not 100% sure at this time. Now the next orebe, oh great. Now before that we've got 6156. Again, they're going to say that it's sweet or pleasant. It has two entries, and again, if you apply covering to this, sort of a covering blanket, or night to these obscure passages, you're going to find that it can work as well, and oftentimes it gives you a better understanding. Now, the crazy thing is, So many of these poorly translated words, these words they've schismed and translated every which way possible or conceivable, they're oftentimes in those books that people so often remember verses from and quote over and over again. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and really bad. Well, and also Song of Songs, and really bad in Job. Job is full of a lot of poetic language. Job's probably one of the worst translated books, pound for pound, that I've ever seen, as far as it having so many unproven words. And even when there are provable words, they freaking translate them completely opposite of what they should be. I literally would see a word like Louis-ton, which is a great sea serpent, and them translating it like the morning. I kid you not. Well, anyways, so the next... where's my next OBRY? I wanted to go over OBRY before I get to 6157, the swarm. I really did want to go over the second OBRY. Give me one sec here. The way I listed these for my notes was a little different. Here it is. Okay. The next OBRY is 6160. And it's typically translated as the plain 42 times. Unfortunately, desert 9 times. Which, again, anytime you see desert, it's usually going to be OBRY or midbar. And there's just absolutely no proof that that's desert. It's simply wilderness. We're talking about land that is not inhabited, that has not been tamed. It's not being farmed or worked by anybody. It is the wilderness. That does not mean it has to be desert. That's, again, another one of their ideas they're implanting in people's heads. So, OBRY is also sometimes translated as wilderness. Sometimes it's literally called the proper place, Araba. It can be called the champagne, which there's actually a word for that. It's chapelet. Evenings or heavens. I kid you not. You're going to mostly see this when Israel they're still in the Exodus. They haven't come into the promised land like starting in the book of Joshua. And they're in a region of Moab and a region that was taken over from the children of Moab and Ammon by a tribe of Amory. And there's this very big region that they're staying in or around that they would just call the OBRY. Now, there's other times when they're referring to these regions as OBRY. Everything about them does seem to be plains. Now, what is it that this at the end that I just went into at length would have to do with putting at the end of Oreb to feminize it? Well, there's kind of one other thing to this. Sometimes it seems like putting that in, not only how I told you it could spread in a sense, dilute the route that it proceeds, but could also in a sense be beneath. The idea that I always get, and if you get a different idea, let me know, is that with the plains are typically flat. Having to do with the sunset or the evening, the horizon, the flatness of plains or a bay. Now, I may be incorrect about that, but I personally constantly look and think of plains or prairie. Funny thing is, they actually translate it as plains quite a lot. That's OBRY. The interesting ones we want to get to, I will scroll back to right now. The first one is H6158. It has, excuse me, it has 10 entries as OBRY. You might see OBRY if it's plural. And what they translate it as is raven. Raven is a dark bird, very much like a crow. Now, it's interesting. There's nothing else about the raven, per se, or the crow that I would associate with our concrete OBRY, a covering spread out, other than the darkness of its color. Just like they called that certain tree, they wanted to say it was a dark wood. I think sometimes they slip up and either they grasp the meaning of these things when they didn't mean to, or they accidentally give away the meaning. I don't know. However, it would seem that this bird would be named this based on its darkness. Now, yeah, zoologists who study birds will tell you about all the different variations between ravens and crows. For me, they seem to be very similar in ways. But what seems specific about them is the darkness of their color. Now, it seems like this would actually be pretty accurate. For one thing, it is these birds, this OBRY, that brings food to Elijah, when he is he's kind of hiding out on the other side of Yarden. You see, he was from Glode, and Glode is on the other side of Yarden from the main bulk of the tribal inheritances. It should be east of Yarden. So he's near a brook at the time, and there are these birds, OBRY. They're bringing him food. The interesting thing about that is there are a certain number of birds that are known to be thieves. They will steal from you if you leave certain things out. All birds will, all animals will, really. But there's some that are known more for it than others. Between that and the fact that they're called OBRY and what you can associate that with makes me think that raven's relatively accurate, or crow, a dark bird. Some crows and ravens are actually quite mean. If you have enough ravens or crows around, and you talk to people who live in an area where, let's say, they're infested with crows, there's a lot of crows that hang around a certain place, they will tell you that these animals are a blight, especially if they hang around for a long period of time. My dad, when he was still alive, he was a baker, and he would bake in his home a lot. And whenever he had old bread, he would literally throw it out in the backyard for the birds. And who do you think that attracted? We would sometimes have a dozen or more crows along the ridge of the roof there. And they're imposing. They can have over 4-foot wingspans. They're loud. They're annoying. They are dangerous. There have been reports of crows, ravens, birds like that, causing severe damage to people's heads, poking out eyes. Proverbs 30:17 says, "The eye that mocketh at his father and despiseth to obey his mother, the ravens of the valley shall pick it out, and the young eagles shall eat it." Now, I don't know if that's young eagles or not. But again, I'm telling you that this sounds like raven or crow. And I believe the reason they called that specific sort of bird Orb was because of the darkness of its color. At first, I had kind of wondered if it was Rab because of the fact that some of these birds have a tendency to swarm in gangs. But I think the color part is probably more accurate. Now, the way this gets really interesting is another one of the entries of Orb, and it's spelled exactly the same way, and it's right before this one. It's H6157. The funny thing about this is it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 entries. And out of those 7 entries, they are all either in the book of Exodus, or there are 2 entries in the Psalms referring to what happened before the Exodus in Mitzrayim during the plagues. See, because this Orb is one of the plagues. And after examining this, I have no reason whatsoever to believe that any of the stages of the 10 plagues of Mitzrayim were what we've been told they were. Now, when you look at the Strong's definition of this word H6157, it will say 1, a swarm, A, as a subtext, A, probable meaning from mixture or incessant or involved motion, like swarming and mixing. That's so weird because I've noticed that in a lot of these entries of Orb, they keep wanting to mix. I showed that to you in woof, the garment thing, right? They sometimes want to call that mixed, a mixed fabric. Or in 6148, they'll use it as surety, mortgage, mingled, meaning mixed. Though they use it in mixed probably out of the 11 triglyph roots and an extra 5 with the suffixes on it, mixed in one way or another in more than half of those. And we'll see why. But that's what they tell you, swarm. Seems pretty arbitrary to me. So looking at the Hebrew text in context, every time that, say, Moses says to Pharaoh, that Yahweh is going to send this thing or creature. Not every plague is a creature. If we have all the water turning to blood, that's not a creature. If we have hail, it's not a creature. If we have sores, you see. He's going to send this thing. You always have Oreb. Is always the definite article? Yes, sometimes. No, sometimes. Now, what I considered at first is Oreb in the sense of, could it possibly be like it's used and translated Arabians? Now, oftentimes you're going to see Orebim, but when it's referring to those people as a whole or their sort of nation, you'll see Oreb. And I thought, well, now that would be kind of weird, and it wouldn't be so easy to just bring them in and bring them out. You know, because the invasion of a people that are not like the people of that country, as everybody in the West at least knows, is a plague of sorts. However, I don't think that's quite accurate. If you look back at when it's translated as raven, this dark bird with certain characteristics that you can check out if you look at it in H6158. It is also oftentimes just stated as Oreb. So, what should we believe? Should we believe that it was a plague of flies when there's already words for flies, zabub, for instance, which I think is actually a very good word for fly. Anyways, And there are plenty of occurrences of these other words where you will see flies or insects used to deem that that is accurate. Are we to believe that out of all the other occurrences we see for oreb, and we see that oreb is actually a bird, and it is likely a dark bird, are we to believe that it is in fact, in this case, flies? Because they arbitrarily told us that it can sometimes just mean something swarming or mixing, swarming. They like that, the mixing, swarming. You know, if a huge number of crows or ravens invaded your land, it would be an utter pestilence. And when they say things like, well, what about these times when these things are in people's houses, so on and so forth? If you had a lot of open windows, not difficult. Birds can get in houses more easy than you think. They can fly through windows and bust them out, and then other ones can come in. But more than this, a lot of houses way back when were built with large courtyards on the inside of the house. And the house would be built around the courtyard. Sometimes very large courtyards, sometimes very small courtyards. But it wasn't as hard as you might think for a number of animals to get in the house. What I'm trying to tell you is there's far more weight behind the idea that it was crows, ravens, this dark bird, than flies. There's really no weight whatsoever to the argument that it would be flies. Now, in instances such as 6161 Orebe, they call it pledge again. Again, like a blanket. Orabun, pledge your surety. Again, you know, the couple of interesting entries are 6152 and 6163. Oreb, Orebi, or Orebim, that they call Arabs, or plain dwellers. Now, the first problem I'm going to present with that is, if that's the case, then all of the Arabs today have got a serious problem with practicing Islam, or being Muslims, since that is supposed to be a religion based on Ishmaelites. So I'm afraid you guys can't be both Ishmaelites and Orebim. Which is it? The other thing is, I want to describe to you a little bit about these Orebim folks and let you just think about it for a minute. Who would they be describing? Or do they have to be describing who somebody named the Arabs at some point in time that we're not very familiar with? Oh, and by the way, did I mention that besides them mixing entries of this people, this Oreb people, into the listings such as the bird, the crow or raven, H6158. Yes, they mix a few entries into that are these people, and into the swarms of flies. Yes, they mix a few in there. Well, they also mix them into the, what is it? 60, no. It's the one on 6154. The fabrics, warp and woof, which actually, when I said like blanket or cushion, when you consider it, if it's somebody who's sick, isn't it more likely, since Shati has every characteristic of probably being a cushion, that he was saying whether it be in their blanket or mattress? See, these things, they make more sense, for one thing. They make more sense. And we want to make sense of this. I would think even the critics would want to make sense of this, even though almost none of them actually do any work to make any sense of this. They just want to pick apart at the weaknesses of bad translations given to us by Masoretes and those who supposedly standardized the English as well. However, this people, Oreb, they do have their own entries It is 6152 and 6163. In 6152, you're going to get things like mostly entries starting in 1 Kings 10:15. They would say like, and all the kings of Arabia, although it would be Orib or Oribim. 6152 in Strong's, looking at the OBRY, it is, and sometimes this is, the Orib with the at the beginning, Orib. And again, with the 2 Chronicles 9:14, again, Arabia. Now, there's a reason that you have Arabia, that it's translated or transliterated Arabia, though I would say that's more of a translation than transliteration. If it was a transliteration, they would say Orib, just like it's supposed to appear. In 2 Chronicles 9:14, it is Orib. So sometimes the Orib as in Oreb, sometimes just Orib. Or in Oreb, as in the people or the places they live. In fact, some of these people end up appearing, we'll go to 6163, they end up appearing in Nehemiah because they have moved into the various regions of the land when the men of Judah were extracted by Babel. And again, you're going to see them as, when they're speaking of the people in the plural, Oribim. They give areas around which they live, which, funny enough, some of these areas are quite close to the journey that Israel took when they left Mitzrayim. Now, what's kind of interesting about this, with all of their mixing in of things and how they like to not stay with standard translations and transliterations for words, you end up getting things like Exodus 12:38. This is when Israel finally leaves Mitzrayim. And it says in Exodus 12:38, and a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds and very much cattle. But if you just look at it in OBRY, it will tell you Ugam and also Orib, Rab, Ole, Atam, Utsan, Ubaker. There's that Baker I told you about, that's cattle, cows, or mourning. Makne, Kabad, and great substance, possessions. Usually it's possessions, it's living possessions, makne. That can be servants, cattle, it can be things. Makne covers a lot of ground. However, Orab, Rab. Remember Rab? We talked about Rab at length. A great deal of this people that's called Orab, that's who left with them. And then we'll see from the various entries that they live in certain places near certain people. There is pockets of them near a portion of Edom, which would be near the Didanim. There is a Dedan in Edom. They're described as living near Kedar. Kedar was one of the children of Ishmael. Also, there are those who live near the Cushi, which I actually pinpoint the location where Cush has to be in the book I'm currently writing, in the chapter on the rivers of Eden. I'm really not sure whether these chapters are going to have to be broken into smaller chapters or not. They are what they are. They require the amount of detail that they do. However, so now we know that we are talking about a certain people when we see Oreb or Oreb or Orabim. You just have to contextualize it, make sure we're talking about people and not dark birds. And that's usually easy to do. Even in the case of Mitzrim, as I said, birds can be commanded by their creator to simply fly away. Whereas if it was this huge, influx of people, it doesn't work as well getting them to leave as fast as the plagues would come very quickly, go very quickly. Plus when you see things like them being in their house and on this and that and the other, and that doesn't quite work as well if it's people. So you'd say, why are people given this exact same name as we see in a sunset, in a pledge or surety for someone, in a tree, a type of bird? Then you have these people. Same word. I would suggest that as opposed to the mingling, because there's words for that, you could just say mamzers. They're called that because they were a darker skinned people. I would say that is the most dominant reason. And when you look at all the passages that they're involved in, you see that they live in pockets kind of all over the place. They seem to be quite transient. And they oftentimes, at least a few times, are described as living on the Orebe, the plains. Now, I guess some people could make the argument that they got their name from living on the Orebe, but when we first see them, that's not where they're living. And off the top of my head, I actually can't think of any other people type that would be described in that way. Even people from the East are not described as Kadame. Kadam would be the East. They would be the Kadamni. So you would expect if they were named after the place they lived, they might actually be called the Oramni, something more along those lines. If they were named after the Orebe, the plains. But they're definitely people that live kind of all over the place. In fact, when judgment is being pronounced on Babel, it is in, I want to say it's in Jeremiah, that it says that even the Orabim won't want to dwell there. I'm just trying to find I gotta find the exact entry, just because I don't usually like to leave those things hanging if I don't have to. Yeah, it's Isaiah 13:20. It was right in front of my face. It shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation. Neither shall Oreb pitch tent there, or Orabim. This is the 6163, Isaiah 13:20. I can scroll over it real fast. And it is in the form of Orabi, those of Oreb. It is my speculation that we're talking about a darker people than the descendants of Ham, Shem, Yaphat, Japheth. They're called Oreb, Orabi, Orabim. They lived predominantly on the plains and were transient. Now, people can make an argument. Yes, that's speaking of Arabs, Bedouins, and the such. Or you could make an argument that that's another people in another place who were darker skinned than the people that the Bible is focused on, that were transient and mostly lived on the plains. Now, these people weren't entirely transient in the sense that they did have colonies that were relatively stable near other people, but they didn't have one unified nation, as opposed to they had pockets of them kind of interspersed all over the place. And as I said, when Judah goes to Babel for 70 years, they come back with Nehemiah, Nehemiah, and Ezra. They're there. They've already moved in, and they're occupying portions of the land then. So the very last thing, and I'm going to wrap this, is then why do we keep seeing them trying to stick the definition of mixed in always? Because nothing that we've looked at should give us the impression that it's mixed, that it means mixed, anything of the sort. Unless we go to H6151. This is the one Aramaic entry. It appears twice in Daniel 2:41 and Daniel 2:43, and is translated as, "For as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, or whereas thou saw iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves," there it is again, "with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another." Now, 6151. I'm toggling back and forth between Blue Letter Bible and eSword because I can always look at it in its natural state in eSword, and I can see how it is written out. And I'm looking at the first occurrence of it and trying to find it in the text. And there's one drawback to having all these numbers is you get lost in all the numbers. Ma'orib. In Aramaic Ma'orib, which is really interesting because in OBRY, the word Ma'orib is H4627, and they always want to translate it as merchandise or market, and I'm not so sure about that. Unless we're talking about tents, great tents, which oftentimes markets are underneath. Now, there's nothing in the context of these Arami passages, and I'm just going to find, here we go. Met-orabin, okay, fine. And the same thing, Met-orabin, that's in 2:43. They shall mix themselves. Yeah. You saw iron mixed with clay. You would have the Met-orabim, and they shall mingle themselves, Met-orabim. And 2:43, one more time, Met-orab. And that is where it says, as iron is not mixed with clay. So, if in Aramaic, it does in fact mean mixed, in context it seems to work pretty good. That's fine, because Aramaic is quite a different language. But the clue in all of this should be how so often, over and again, when you see multiple OBRY entries of words, and you see all these different definitions, so that it's so confusing. How can this one word have all these different definitions? You're almost always going to find that if there is an Arami equivalent of it, You find that definition of that Aramee word, and you're probably going to find at least one entry, or more, as we saw in the case of OBRY, because they kept trying to apply mixed over and over again to these different entries. That they're applying an Aramee definition, how an Aramee word that is close to, similar, or at least looks like, using the same glyphs as an OBRY word. They're applying that definition. Why? Because people who spoke natural fluent Aramee as their first language are the people who toyed with all of this. And as I said, up until just a few centuries ago, the language of the rabbis was Aramee. The language of all the people, well, not all of them, but a lot of the people who surrounded Yisrael in the promised land, Canaan, they often spoke Aramee. That was more the lingua franca of that area than OBRY was. There were more peoples that spoke that than spoke OBRY. And I would imagine that it's very possible that besides for just the Aramee people themselves, very possibly the Hamati, different tribes of Canaan, there were a number of them, and some of the people that were moved in. It even says in Daniel that the people of Babel, the Kashidim, spoke Aramee. So thus the people who they moved in, like the Separuim or Sephardics, spoke Aramee. And they didn't fluently speak OBRY. So they have oftentimes transferred many of their understandings to OBRY. And with that, I believe I'm already over 2 hours. So unless I have time to edit this down and cut out some of the blank spots, that's just what it turns out to be. So until I'm able to do the next one, sorry about this one being late, but everybody take care of yourselves, study hard, hang in there. See you next time.